Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you're watching this, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. Okay, and we're going to start this time with some genuine good news. I always like to do that whenever I can, start that way. So on February 22nd, the Virginia House and Senate agreed on a bill to abolish the death penalty in the state. The bill now goes to Governor Ralph Northam, who has already said that he will sign the bill, which means that Virginia is just about to become the 23rd state to abolish this remnant of barbarity. It's perhaps particularly notable in the case of Virginia because Virginia's had a death penalty on its books since its establishment as a crown colony in over 400 years ago. In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, only to reverse that decision 4 years later in 1976. Since that time, Virginia has murdered 113 inmates, second only to Texas. And it's worth noting that 46% of those killed were African Americans in a state where they make up only about 20% of the population. Meanwhile, on a national level, a special report from the Death Penalty Information Center, released February 18th, shows that the number of people who had been sentenced to death who have since been exonerated has reached 185. The report revealed that 69% of those wrongful convictions involved, quoting, official misconduct by police, prosecutors, or other government officials, as well as finding patterns of perjury and racial bias. As the organization Witness to Innocence points out, these wrongful convictions were not accidents. They were symptoms of a system wrought with abuse. Happily, Virginia is on the verge of getting on the right side of justice and history in this regard. There's also cause for hope on the national level. Joe Biden is the first president to openly oppose the death penalty, and he's promised to support legislation to that end. Now, given the slim majorities, the truly slim majorities his party has in both houses of Congress, legislation to put an end to the federal death penalty once and for all may not be so easy to achieve. But as 37 members of the House recently reminded him, he does have the power on his own to call an end to federal executions and death sentences and to commute the sentence of those who are already on death row. It remains to be seen how far he'll go, if he will use what is clearly a president's authority, or will he limit himself to the symbolism of saying, I'd like to see a bill passed, while taking no actual action toward that end. But in either event, at least this time, it's possible. Now, next up, some people might not agree that this is good news, but I think it is, and it's my show, so I'm doing it. As of February 1st, the state of Oregon has decriminalized the possession of small amounts of heroin, methamphetamine, LSD, oxycodone, and other hard drugs. This is the result of a public referendum on the issue that passed by a 16-point margin in November. Now, I'll just mention in passing that personally, I don't think LSD deserves to be lumped in as a hard drug with the rest on that list, since at the very least there's no evidence of an addiction to LSD, but leave that aside. The point is that now, instead of years in prison followed by difficulty finding jobs and housing, people found in possession of small amounts of the listed drugs will face a $100 fine and a health evaluation that could lead to addiction counseling. The same measure also establishes a network of addiction recovery centers to be funded from the millions of dollars of tax revenue that Oregon gets from its legal cannabis industry. In addition to treatment, these centers will also be involved in housing and job assistance to provide long-term security for those people struggling with addiction. Another benefit of this, by the way, is that it will likely lead to a reduction in the racial and ethnic disparities in drug arrests and convictions. Now, this is the first for the U.S., but not for the world. Other countries, including Portugal, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, have already decriminalized possession of small amounts of hard drugs, and they've done it without finding the surge in drug use that opponents of measures like this always predict would be the result if we were ever to end our useless, failed so-called war on drugs. Oregon is good news. All right, next up, we have a couple of things that could be considered good news overall, but each of them comes with an asterisk. Last month, as part of his executive orders in relation to racial justice, Joe Biden reimposed Obama-era restrictions on a federal program run by the Law Enforcement Support Office. It's called the 1033 program, and it's the one where ostensibly surplus military equipment is given to local police departments. In 2015, the amazing Mr. O ordered that military equipment such as armored vehicles, grenade launchers, flashbang grenades, high-caliber weapons, and so on, not be part of the program. But in 2017, Tweety Pie reversed that order. Biden has now reversed it, reimposing the restrictions. And okay, this is a good thing, clearly and undoubtedly. But here's the asterisk. It doesn't go far enough. The whole program, the whole thing is a crappy program that inevitably leads to justified suspicion from the targets of this program on the one hand, and increased arrogance from its beneficiaries on the other, who got to play macho man in the streets of their cities and even small towns. During the campaign, Biden accurately said, quoting him, "The last thing you need is an up-armored Humvee coming into a neighborhood. It is like the military invading, they become the enemy." Which is not entirely accurate, because all too often for too many of the communities that are the targets of these programs, the police have already given ample cause to be perceived as enemies even before the Humvees appear. But again, let that pass. More importantly, he should have added to his statement that this very militarized manner of policing makes the cops view anyone on the street, particularly those in a protest, particularly if there are non-white people in a protest, as their enemy. That is even more than they already do, and they are, after all, the ones with almost all the guns. More than that, this program doesn't even work. Despite distributing over $7.4 billion in military equipment to over 11,500 local cop agencies, the program has, according to two independent studies released in December, it's produced no measurable effect on the crime rate. Instead, at least one more study indicates it's actually done the opposite. A study of Georgia police departments and sheriff's offices done by the staff of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and published in October found that those agencies that got more than $1,000 worth of equipment through the 1033 program on average killed 4 times as many people as those that didn't. That was after controlling for statistical variables such as community income, rural-urban differences, racial makeup, and violent crime rates. Now, I have to tell you, I still think that defund the police is a lousy slogan because, one, it doesn't express the actual goal, which is that we have to rethink how we do law enforcement, or more exactly, we need to rethink how we do public safety, and that we should stop making people with guns by default the first choice. 2, at the same time, it suggests to those who don't know what you actually mean that it hints that what you really want to do is eliminate law enforcement altogether. Which is why, even though it also fails at snappily expressing the true goal, I think a slogan of demilitarize the police would do much more to initiate a move in that direction of restructuring. The reason I bring this up now is that to that should be added the slogan Deep 6 1033. Because while the reimposition of the earlier restrictions on the program is a good thing, limiting it is simply not enough. The 1033 program should be shut down entirely. Legislation to do exactly that was introduced in both houses of Congress last summer. They went nowhere then, but they should be reintroduced and made a central focus of federal-level efforts at police reform now. Because if that happens, that would definitely be a good thing. All right, next, not so much good news as just something that made me smile. David Hogg, a survivor of the Parkland school shooting who has become a leading advocate for gun control, has announced a new venture. He's starting a pillow company, apparently to be called Good Pillow, and it's intended to go in direct competition with the My Pillow guy Mike Lindell, the Tweety Pie acolyte, election fraud conspiracy nut, and all-around right-wing flake. Hogg promises the pillows will be union-made, and the company will support progressive causes while employing ex-prisoners and others trying to get their lives in gear. Now, it remains to be seen if this will actually come to pass. I mean, the reality is a great many startups fail even before the first product reaches the stores, but the vision of it did make me smile. What didn't make me smile was the reaction among some of his colleagues. Here comes the asterisk. In a tweeted statement, March for Our Lives announced that Hogg, who was a co-founder of the group, was taking a leave of absence as a board member, quote, to take some time for himself to reflect and recommit to the mission, which sounds way too much like a parent saying to a naughty child, go to your room and think about what you've done and come back when you're ready to recommit to the family, to think of it any other way. The fact that another founder of the group, Carmen Kasky, called Hogg's planned company a grift is given no reason for me to change that impression. And so the search for purity continues. As a footnote, Mike Lindingeling has trouble on another front. Dominion Voting Systems, one of the largest makers of voting machines in the U.S., has sued him, claiming that he defamed the company with his accusations that it had rigged the 2020 election in favor of Joe Biden. Dominion is seeking more than $1.3 billion in damages. Now, this is another case, and we'll have to see how it goes, but I do admit to finding it pleasant to see one of the purveyors of paranoia facing the chances of consequences for their litany of lies. Now, meanwhile, there has also been some good news on the front of LGBTQ rights. On his first day in office, Joe Biden signed an executive order looking to undo the damage during the Tweety Pie regime. But unlike a number of other orders, which only look to revert to the status of the Obama years, sort of like, Obama 2.0, this one drew on an historic decision from the Supreme Court last June. In that case, Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, SCOTUS ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects workers from workplace discrimination related to sexual orientation and gender identity. So Biden's order went beyond even that to say that not only workplace, but the law is also going to be interpreted as applying to areas like housing and education. On February 11th, HUD became the first federal agency to formally adopt the change, declaring that, yes, LGBTQ people are protected from housing discrimination by federal law, and that addressing such discrimination is within the agency's reach. The Department of Education will no doubt follow once it completes its own legally required review. Meanwhile, on February 4th, Biden issued a presidential memorandum aimed at expanding protection of the rights of LGBTQ people worldwide, including potentially through the use of financial and other sanctions. The memo directs U.S. agencies that are working abroad to work harder to combat criminalization of LGBTQ people by foreign governments. It also directs the State Department to include anti-LGBTQ violence discrimination laws in its annual Human Rights Report. And it calls for increased efforts to ensure LGBTQ asylum seekers have equal access to protection, calls for expanded training for federal personnel, and the increased use of priority referrals to expedite resettlement of vulnerable people. Significantly, it instructs agencies to consider appropriate responses, including the full range of diplomatic tools, including financial sanctions and visa restrictions. Doing this when foreign governments restrict the rights of LGBTQ people. And just like the earlier executive order, this memorandum is not simply a reversion to the status under Obama, but it goes beyond it, not only in the freeing up of diplomatic tools, but in directing U.S. representatives to seek out global allies and partners in advancing LGBTQ rights worldwide. On a related note, the International Human Rights Defense Act, which would serve as legislative reinforcement of the memorandum, has been reintroduced in both houses of Congress. Now, there was some caution expressed about the memorandum by some LGBTQ rights leaders worldwide who said that lessons learned during the Obama administration suggested that tough policies and sanctions can sometimes backfire by discrediting local communities. Jessica Stern, executive director of Outright Action International, noted that, quoting, "One of the most effective and consistent ways of discrediting our movement is to say that they are the result of colonial and Western imposition, that they're getting paid by foreign donors." So she advised any sanctions should be applied on a case-by-case basis. Now, even with that caveat, what we've seen from the Blonde administration goes beyond merely recovering ground lost over the last 4 years, which means it is still a real step forward, and that is good news. The asterisk is that it's also necessary good news, because despite the reality of some gains, LGBTQ rights are still a major issue around the world. Homosexuality is still criminalized in 69 countries, 9 of which impose the death penalty. 2 countries have duplicated Russia's anti-LGBTQ propaganda law, which makes it a crime not just to be LGBTQ, but to discuss it in any positive or accepting way. Meanwhile, same-sex marriage is legal in only 29 out of 195 countries around the world. And despite the undoubted gains in the United States, the battle here is far from won. In fact, we've recently seen what LGBTQ advocates say is an organized assault on transgender youth by conservative groups spearheaded by the so-called Alliance Defending Freedom, an anti-LGBTQ hate group. Most recently, on February 11th, the North Dakota House of Representatives passed on to the state Senate a bill that would ban transgender student athletes from joining teams that do not match their sex assigned at birth, and would withhold state funds from any sporting event that allows transgender athletes to play on a team based on their gender identity. That same day, the Mississippi State Senate passed on to that state's House its own athletic ban. Georgia, Kansas, Utah, and Tennessee advanced similar legislation during the preceding week, and other such bills are under consideration in Montana, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arizona, Kansas, and elsewhere. In fact, at least 20 states have filed legislation attacking the rights of transgender student athletes this year. To date, the only trans sports bill that became law was in Idaho. That happened last summer, but so far its implementation has been blocked by a federal injunction. I think young athletes are not the only young folks in the crosshairs of anti-transgender bigotry. A number of states, including Alabama, Texas, Kentucky, and South Dakota, are prohibiting transition-related medical care for minors. Some of these include criminal penalties. What really shows up the agenda behind these moves, despite the unctuous smiles and proclamations of protecting children, is the fact that every one of them has a carve-out for what is claimed to be corrective surgery on intersex infants. Intersex describes people born with either a mixture of or ambiguous primary sexual characteristics. About 1.7% of the U.S. population is intersex. And since the 1950s, parents of intersex infants have been pushed to allow surgery to force those infants to be definable as either male or female. It's a push continuing even now, despite declining support among the medical community and increasing opposition from parents. These bills, just like the ones about student athletes, have nothing to do with protection of children or girls' athletic opportunities or anything else other than defining what is acceptable, being able to declare some other, as being just not us, and being able to ban the different from full citizenship and full personhood. Now, the thing is, in some ways, these same bills are a hopeful sign. The bigots couldn't stop same-sex marriage. Their transgender bathroom bills went nowhere, so they've turned their sights on trans youth because they're running out of targets. But while it does point up their desperation, it does nothing to ameliorate the cruelty involved in going after a group of young people who, according to studies, are more likely to face bullying, harassment, and assault at school, more likely to drop out of school, more likely to become homeless, and more likely to live with mental health struggles like depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Indeed, according to a survey by the American Association of Pediatrics, 41% of non-binary youth, 29% of trans female students, and more than half of trans male teens have reported attempting suicide at some point in their lives. In the words of transgender advocate and triathlete Chris Mosier, quoting, "Trans people do not transition because they think it would be cool or because their friends are doing it. Transgender identity is not a fad. Young trans people do not transition for social points or to stand out. It is not just a phase. No one in this world is transitioning for any reason other than survival." And he is absolutely right. And denying that reality is cruel and potentially lethal, and those that do so are the basest of bigots. And I need a break. And we are back. And we are back with our recurring feature, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns, and outrages. I only have time for one of each this time, so we will start as we usually do with our clown. Earlier, I noted that various states are considering bills to restrict or ban medical treatment for transgender youth. One in Kentucky merits special attention. It employs the right-wing's latest go-to excuse, the conscience exemption, where a medical professional can refuse to act in the best interest of the patient based on a claim that it violates their convictions. Now, I have to tell, I am a sincere and committed, deeply committed advocate to the right of conscience. But this has nothing to do with conscience. This has everything to do with enabling anti-trans bigotry. To see that, we need only look at the words of the bill's sponsor, one Representative Stephen Meredith, and I'm quoting him here. "You have a 12-year-old girl who's a tomboy, and her parents, who are misguided, think she's really a girl trapped in a boy's body, and they don't want to see her go through the rest of her life miserable, so they're going to go and transition her." Okay, so not only does he not even understand the terms of the discussion, since the parents will be seeing her as a boy trapped in a girl's body, not the other way around, his vision is that if parents taking a 12-year-old girl to be forcibly surgically altered to male without her desire or consent. And if that wasn't insane enough, in the real world, transitioning is a long and complex process, even if there is no surgery, which actually only occurs in about 25% of cases. It's a process which involves counseling and years of hormone therapy, across all of which time we're supposed to think that neither parents nor counselors nor surgeons would ever notice that she doesn't want to do it. That, according to him, is the kind of realistic scenario that we must enable bigotry in order to guard against. If it's true that ignorance is bliss, Representative Stephen Meredith of Kentucky must be one extremely happy clown. All right, moving on to the outrage. On February 23rd, the Israeli government began delivering doses of coronavirus vaccine to Honduras, Guatemala, and the Czech Republic. Now, why those three countries? Is there some humanitarian reason? Are they facing critically short supplies? Well, no and no. What the three have in common is that they have either moved or agreed to move their embassies to Jerusalem. That is, this is a reward for their diplomatic support of Israel's apartheid policies. And it's a reward given even as Palestinians under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza struggle to obtain inoculations, and the administration of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delayed delivery of vaccines while the Knesset argued about whether or not to use them as bargaining chips. Although Netanyahu's office said on the 23rd that it's giving some of its surplus corona vaccines to the Palestinians, the vast majority of people in the occupied territories are still without access. According to its own health ministry, Israel has vaccinated 70% of its population over 16. Meanwhile, the West Bank and Gaza have received 32,000 vaccine doses, which is enough to inoculate something less than 0.5% of the 5.2 million Palestinians who live there. Last week, the Israeli government finally agreed to help vaccinate 100,000 Palestinians who regularly cross into Israel for work. The point here being, of course, that that's what's important, not getting Palestinians inoculated, but just making sure they don't bring it into Israel. Matthias Kennis, a registered nurse and medical referent for Doctors Without Borders COVID-19 response in the West Bank city of Hebron, said on February 22nd that, quoting, "You are over 60 times more likely to have a vaccination in Israel than in Palestine. It is," he said, "inexplicable and unbelievable. Worse than that, it is unjust and cruel." Meanwhile, journalist Neri Zilber called it both a bad health policy and a disgrace. And it is all that. It is unjust. It is cruel. It is bad health policy. It is a disgrace. It is also typical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, which is an outrage. All right, we're going to end up this way. Let's do this quick. Last time I went through my rules for right-wingers, a look at the various ways that right-wing avoids facing reality or dealing in honest debate, or both. I figured just for the heck of it, this time out, I'd offer a few actual examples, all drawn from the last couple of weeks so that you can look out for your own. All right, first, Senator Ted Cruz has repeatedly brayed about fraud in November elections. Not just November elections, campaigning in Georgia for the runoff there. He claimed in so many words that the Democrats were going to try to steal the election. He refused to call Biden president-elect. He made clear his intent to challenge the ceremonial certification of the Electoral College vote. And then after the mob attacked the Capitol, Cruz told the Houston TV station that he was not, this is his word, remotely responsible for what happened. Rule number 12, never, never, never admit any responsibility for the meaning or impact of your own words. Second, Coppers in the House tried to amend the resolution calling for Representative Marjorie Taylor Color of Nausea to be stripped of her committee assignments by having each time Color of Nausea's name appeared in the resolution be replaced with that of Ilhan Omar, based on her statement some time ago that some people interpreted as anti-Semitic, a statement for which she apologized, saying she was unaware of its anti-Semitic overtones and actually thanked her critics for educating her on the matter. Rule number 16, freely employ false analogies. Third, Senator Ron, my brains come from the John's son, minimized the significance of the attack on the Capitol, just saying nobody condones that, which of course he did, considering that one meaning of condone is overlook an offense with relative tolerance. And he then said that Democrats were hypocrites for not denouncing occasional violence that occurred during last summer's protest. Rule number 4, issue a lengthy ranting denunciation of the left, which should look to include the words hypocrites or hypocrisy. Fourth and last, I'll make this last for this time because I am running short of time here. Until an organizing resolution was finalized to deal with the 50-50 split in the Senate, Lindsey Graham-Cracker was still chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. As such, he refused to allow a hearing for Merrick Garland's nomination as Attorney General. Graham-Cracker, who was part of Fishface McConnell's push to get as many reactionary judges on the federal bench as possible and eagerly participated in the breakneck race to get Amy Bugs Bunny Barrett on the bench, he accused Democrats of wanting to rush through Judge Garland's hearing. Rule number 19, intellectual consistency and honesty are for wusses and losers. Finally, we'll wrap this up with a new rule. I'm going to have to reorganize this. It's getting kind of long, but for now. Rule 22, all progressive proposals are too radical. This especially applies to proposals that are popular, such as a Green New Deal, national health care, having the rich pay more in taxes, and a $15 minimum wage. That's it. We are out of here. I will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. Wear the damn mask. And peace.